Today, the estate still stands, vast, immaculate, preserved, its towers cleaned, its halls curated, its story carefully framed for public consumption. Yet what remains is not what it was. The building survives, but the system that gave it meaning has been hollowed out. Hearst Castle no longer functions as an estate, it functions as an artifact. The rooms are intact, but the power that once animated them has dispersed. Ownership changed not through conquest or fire, but through something quieter, institutional absorption. What was once a private organism of wealth, control, and cultural confidence has been stabilized, catalogued, and neutralized. This transformation matters because Hearst was never just architecture. It was a statement about permanence in a country that rarely believed in it. Built not to be efficient, not to be modest, but to be overwhelming, it embodied an American elite attempting to imitate European continuity while inventing its own version of empire. The loss was not dramatic, no collapse, no ruin. Instead, something subtler occurred. The estate outlived its ideology, stewardship gave way to preservation, power gave way to policy. What once operated as a private world now exists as a managed experience. Hearst Castle tells a larger story about American wealth, how it accumulates rapidly, consolidates visibly, and then, without collapse, becomes unsustainable as a living system. The estate was too large, too complex, too personal to survive the conditions that created it. What stands today is not failure. It is survival without dominance. And that distinction explains far more about American old money than any fortune ever could. The estate exists now in a state of careful stillness. Its walls are intact, its terraces swept, its interiors stabilized against time. Every surface appears resolved, yet the resolution is deceptive. What survives is the structure, not the system. Hearst Castle no longer operates as an estate, it endures as a managed condition. Preservation has replaced authority. Control has been transferred from private intention to public process. The rooms remain furnished, but their purpose has been suspended. They are neither lived in nor abandoned. They are held. This holding measured, regulated, permanent marks a fundamental shift in what the estate is allowed to be. An estate is not simply land and architecture. It is a living arrangement of decisions, hierarchies, labor, and risk. It requires command. In its present form, Hearst Castle is relieved of command. No one decides how it must grow, contract, or adapt. Its future is no longer an extension of will, but an obligation to maintain equilibrium. The result is stability without direction. Visitors move through the castle along prescribed paths. Movement is limited, curated, timed. The experience is designed to prevent erosion, to protect surfaces, to minimize strain. This is not incidental. It reflects the estate's new logic. Where once the castle absorbed pressure, economic, social, operational, it now avoids it. The building's survival depends on restriction rather than expansion. This transformation did not occur through collapse. There was no visible failure, no dramatic abandonment. The estate did not fall, it was transferred. That distinction matters. Collapse leaves ruins. Transfer leaves continuity. Hearst Castle was not destroyed, it was neutralized. Its functions were separated from its form, leaving an object without agency. The castle's present condition reflects a broader institutional truth. When power becomes incompatible with its environment, it is often preserved rather than exercised. The estate's size, complexity, and cost no longer align with private ownership. What once signaled dominance now signals liability. Preservation resolves that tension by removing responsibility from individual control. Yet preservation also fixes the estate in a single interpretation of itself. The castle is no longer allowed to evolve. It cannot respond to changing conditions except through maintenance. Its identity has been frozen at the moment of transfer, defined by what it was rather than what it could become. In this state, relevance becomes historical rather than functional. The loss then is not architectural, it is operational. Hearst Castle no longer tests wealth, authority, or endurance. It no longer requires a system capable of sustaining its scale. The pressures that once shaped daily life within its walls have been extracted. What remains is an environment stripped of consequence. This absence is quiet. There is no visible marker of diminished power. The estate appears complete. But completion is not vitality. The castle survives because it no longer demands anything of its owner, nor imposes risk on its stewards. It has been made safe, economically, culturally, institutionally. What disappears in this process is the estate's capacity to function as a living institution. Without command, without adaptation, without exposure to failure, the castle becomes an artifact of resolved history. It exists outside the conditions that once justified its existence. The central question emerges here, unresolved and unavoidable. If an estate can survive only by surrendering control, what does that reveal about the limits of private power in America? And what, precisely, is lost when survival replaces dominance as the primary goal? The estate's current condition depends on a constant act of subtraction. Risk is removed. Variability is eliminated. Decisions are deferred to policy. What was once governed by preference is now governed by procedure. This shift does not announce itself, but it governs every aspect of the castle's existence. Nothing inside Hearst Castle now requires judgment under pressure. There are no competing priorities, no negotiations between ambition and cost, no private calculations about sustainability. Maintenance follows schedules. Conservation follows standards. Change occurs only when authorized, documented, and justified. The estate functions within margins designed to prevent loss, not to enable purpose. This creates a form of endurance that is fundamentally different from power. Power absorbs uncertainty. It makes demands. It accepts the possibility of failure as a condition of control. Preservation rejects this logic entirely. Its success depends on avoiding exposure. In doing so, it removes the very pressures that once made the estate meaningful as a system. Hearst Castle's size once implied command over resources vast enough to sustain it. That implication no longer holds. The estate's survival now depends on institutional buffering, public funding, administrative oversight, controlled access. These mechanisms do not extend the estate's original function, they replace it. The castle is sustained, but it is no longer tested. The result is a space that feels complete yet inert. The rooms are intact, but they do not accumulate history. Nothing new is produced within them. No decisions made there alter the future of the estate itself. Time passes, but it leaves no imprint beyond wear, carefully managed and corrected. This condition reveals a limit embedded in American elite culture. Scale was pursued without continuity. Grandeur was achieved without a structure capable of carrying it forward indefinitely. The estate's transfer was not a failure of vision, but a failure of inheritance, ideological rather than familial. There was no durable system designed to replace private authority once it became untenable. In Europe, estates of similar ambition often survived by evolving their role within society, absorbing political change while maintaining private relevance. Hearst Castle could not do this without abandoning the logic that created it. Its scale was inseparable from personal control. Once that control dissolved, the estate had no secondary function to assume. Preservation resolves this impasse by redefining success. Survival becomes the sole metric. The castle's continued existence is framed as triumph enough, but this framing obscures the cost. The estate is no longer a site where wealth organizes labor, culture, and power. It has been reduced to a record of those forces, carefully stabilized to prevent reinterpretation through use. This is not decay. It is a more disciplined ending. The estate remains visible, impressive, intact, yet its authority has been fully externalized. Decisions affecting its future are made elsewhere, according to criteria unrelated to the ambitions that once justified its scale. Hearst Castle now exists as evidence rather than instrument. It demonstrates what American private power could construct and what it could not sustain. Its preservation answers the practical question of how to keep the structure standing. It does not answer the deeper question of how such an institution might have continued to live. That unresolved tension, the difference between endurance and authority, defines the estate's present. It stands complete, but no longer sovereign, and in that condition, it begins to reveal the limits, not of architecture, but of the system that once animated it. Hearst Castle mattered because it attempted something America had rarely sustained, the transformation of private wealth into cultural authority. It was not designed merely to impress, nor to retreat from public life. It was constructed as a declaration that power in the United States could be permanent, cultivated, and institutionally serious. At the time of its creation, American wealth was still viewed as provisional. Fortunes appeared quickly, expanded aggressively, and disappeared just as fast. Industrial success conferred money, but not legitimacy. The older hierarchies of Europe, rooted in land, lineage, and endurance, remained culturally dominant. Hearst Castle was an effort to bridge that divide, not by imitation alone, but by scale and insistence. The estate's significance lay in its refusal to behave like a residence. It was too large to be casual, too complex to be incidental. Every aspect of its design communicated permanence: stone over wood, elevation over concealment, accumulation over restraint. The message was deliberate. This was not wealth-seeking acceptance. It was wealth-asserting equivalence. In American culture, legitimacy has often depended on utility. Buildings justified themselves through productivity: factories, offices, infrastructure. Hearst Castle rejected this logic. It produced nothing measurable. Its value lay entirely in symbolism. It existed to be seen, to be known, to stand as evidence that American power could afford excess without apology. This excess was not chaotic. It was ordered, curated, and ideologically coherent. Art, architecture, and landscape were assembled to construct a narrative of inevitability. The estate suggested continuity where none yet existed. It proposed that American elites could root themselves in place, history, and taste, rather than remain transient beneficiaries of economic cycles. The castle also functioned as a social instrument. It gathered influence into a single geographic point. To be present, there was to be recognized. The estate created a controlled environment where cultural authority could be staged and reinforced. Participation was selective, but visibility was strategic. The estate amplified power by concentrating it. What made this significant was not extravagance, but ambition. Hearst Castle was not content to mirror European aristocratic spaces. It sought to rival them. In doing so, it exposed a central tension in American elite culture: the desire for permanence within a system defined by mobility and disruption. The estate's importance, then, was ideological. It argued that American wealth did not need centuries to legitimize itself. Scale, coherence, and confidence could substitute for lineage. The castle embodied that argument in stone, art, and geography. This mattered because it challenged prevailing assumptions about American power. It suggested that the nation's elite could move beyond accumulation toward stewardship, beyond novelty toward continuity. Whether that argument could hold was uncertain, but the attempt itself reshaped expectations of what private wealth might claim. Hearst Castle mattered not because it was large, but because it demanded to be taken seriously as an institution. It insisted that American power could be cultured, deliberate, and lasting. That insistence gave the estate its meaning and set the conditions for the pressures that would eventually test it. The estate's cultural weight was reinforced by how it positioned itself in relation to the nation it inhabited. Hearst Castle was neither urban nor isolated by accident. Its elevation and distance were strategic. Removed from commercial centers, it did not compete with industry or finance. Instead, it stood above them, both physically and symbolically. The estate suggested that true authority did not need proximity to production. This separation allowed the castle to operate as a parallel cultural center. It was not bound to regional identity or local tradition. It projected a national presence while remaining geographically detached. This detachment signaled autonomy. The estate existed on its own terms, governed by a private vision rather than civic obligation. In doing so, Hearst Castle reframed what American success could look like. It challenged the idea that wealth must continuously prove its usefulness. The estate did not justify itself through innovation or efficiency. Its justification was existence itself. To build and sustain such a place was presented as sufficient evidence of legitimacy. This mattered deeply in a society still negotiating its relationship with inherited power. American elites lacked the social infrastructure that had historically supported aristocracy elsewhere. There were no centuries-old estates to anchor status. Hearst Castle attempted to manufacture that infrastructure through scale and cultural density. It condensed symbols of permanence into a single site, accelerating what lineage had traditionally provided over generations. The estate also imposed a standard. By existing, it redefined the upper boundary of private ambition. It made clear that American wealth was no longer constrained by modesty or defensiveness. The castle normalized excess as a form of seriousness. In doing so, it influenced how power presented itself across the elite class, raising expectations rather than satisfying them. This influence extended beyond architecture. Hearst Castle modeled a way of thinking about ownership. Possession was not framed as temporary stewardship, but as a claim to cultural authorship. The estate asserted that its owner could curate history, assemble meaning, and define taste at a national scale. What gave this assertion force was coherence. The estate did not scatter its symbols. Everything within it served a unified narrative of endurance and authority. That unity distinguished it from displays of wealth that merely accumulated. Hearst Castle was a system designed to speak consistently, even when silent. This is why the estate mattered beyond its walls. It demonstrated a version of American power that sought legitimacy through presence rather than participation. It proposed that permanence could be declared, not earned gradually. Whether that proposition was sustainable was not immediately visible. At its height, the estate appeared to validate its own logic. But significance does not require permanence to be real. Hearst Castle mattered because it revealed what American elites wanted power to be. It clarified their aspirations, their insecurities, and their assumptions about continuity. The estate functioned as a cultural argument made physical. That argument would eventually encounter limits. Yet its articulation reshaped the landscape of American elite ambition. Hearst Castle did not merely reflect wealth, it redefined what wealth believed it deserved. Hearst Castle was conceived not from comfort, but from unease. Its origins lie in a moment when American wealth had achieved scale, but not certainty. The economic power existed. The cultural confidence did not. The estate emerged as an answer to that imbalance, a built response to the anxiety of impermanence. At the turn of the 20th century, American elites occupied an unstable position. Their fortunes rivaled Europe's, yet their legitimacy remained conditional. Wealth could be earned quickly, but it could also be lost just as fast. There were no inherited estates to anchor authority, no centuries-old institutions to absorb volatility. Power existed in motion, not in place. Hearst Castle was an attempt to arrest that motion. Its construction marked a deliberate shift from accumulation to consolidation. Instead of expanding outward through enterprises, influence was drawn inward, concentrated into land, architecture, and controlled environment. The estate proposed that permanence could be engineered through scale. This was not nostalgia, it was strategic. The castle did not replicate a single European model, it assembled many. Its ambition was synthetic rather than ancestral. The estate was designed to compress history, to bypass the slow formation of tradition by assembling its symbols at once. In this way, the castle functioned as an accelerated institution, substituting accumulation for inheritance. The choice of location reinforced this logic. Elevated, remote, commanding, the site removed the estate from the rhythms of ordinary life. Distance created authority. Separation implied sovereignty. The land itself became part of the argument that power need not negotiate its presence, only assert it. This assertion responded directly to insecurity. American wealth was vast, but socially untested. The estate's scale was defensive as much as expressive. Excess served as insulation. By exceeding expectation, the castle sought to foreclose doubt. Its size was not indulgent, it was preventative. The ideology embedded in the estate treated ownership as authorship. To build was to define. The castle was not intended to adapt to society, but to stand apart from it, offering a model of elite order immune to public fluctuation. In this sense, the estate resembled a fortress, not against physical threat, but against cultural erosion. Every aspect of the project reinforced this stance. Complexity discouraged replication. Cost discouraged challenge. The estate was constructed to be singular, unapproachable, and self-justifying. Its existence was meant to resolve questions about status by making them irrelevant. What mattered most was not who built the castle, but why such a structure felt necessary. Hearst Castle emerged from a moment when American elites sensed that economic dominance alone was insufficient. The estate was an attempt to translate money into permanence, scale into legitimacy, and possession into authority. This translation required confidence in architecture as ideology. Stone, elevation, and enclosure were not aesthetic choices, they were instruments. The castle did not ask to be recognized. It assumed recognition as a consequence of its presence. Yet embedded within this ambition was a contradiction. The estate sought permanence in a system defined by change. It aimed to stabilize identity within a culture that rewarded disruption. That tension did not undermine the project at its outset. On the contrary, it fueled it. The greater the instability outside, the more necessary the fortress appeared. Hearst Castle was built as a solution. Whether it could endure the conditions it sought to escape remained unanswered at its origin. The fortress logic extended beyond protection into control. Hearst Castle was not designed to coexist with its surroundings, but to dominate them symbolically. Its elevation did more than provide views. It established hierarchy. The landscape below became subordinate, a supporting element rather than an equal participant. This spatial arrangement mirrored the estate's ideological position within American society. The castle's scale was intentionally disproportionate. It exceeded practical need by orders of magnitude. This excess was not ornamental. It was declarative. By building beyond utility, the estate rejected the American tradition of pragmatism. It asserted that power did not need justification through efficiency. Presence alone was sufficient. This rejection mattered because American culture had long treated excess with suspicion. Wealth was tolerated when it produced value, but questioned when it simply existed. Hearst Castle challenged that norm directly. It proposed that authority could be aesthetic, that legitimacy could be architectural. In doing so, it reframed how elite ambition might be expressed. The estate's complexity reinforced this claim. Its layered construction, prolonged development, and accumulation of styles created a sense of inevitability. The castle appeared less like a project and more like a condition, something that had grown rather than been built. This illusion of organic emergence was critical. It suggested continuity where none yet existed. At its core, the estate functioned as a buffer against uncertainty. By anchoring power in land and structure, it sought to insulate wealth from volatility. Markets could fluctuate, industries could rise and fall, but stone endured. The castle embodied a belief that material permanence could stabilize social position, yet this belief required absolute control. The estate's ideology left little room for adaptation. It assumed that the conditions requiring a fortress would remain constant. The castle was not designed to negotiate change, but to outlast it. This rigidity was both its strength and its vulnerability. The fortress was also inward-facing. Its grandeur did not invite integration, it demanded recognition. The estate did not seek validation through participation in public life. Instead, it positioned itself as an alternative center of gravity. Influence was to be drawn inward, absorbed, and contained. This inward orientation shaped the estate's relationship with time. The castle did not anticipate succession in the conventional sense. It was not built to be modified gradually by future generations. Its completeness implied finality. The estate presented itself as finished, as though the question of continuity had already been answered. But continuity cannot be declared, it must be sustained. The fortress ideology assumed that scale alone could substitute for institutional depth. It underestimated the need for systems capable of evolving beyond their original purpose. The castle's origins prioritized assertion over resilience. This was not a miscalculation at the moment of creation. Within its historical context, the strategy was coherent. American elites lacked precedent, and Hearst Castle attempted to create one through force of presence. The estate did not emerge from tradition. It attempted to generate tradition through immediacy. In doing so, it revealed the limits of architectural authority. A fortress can repel external threat, but it cannot resolve internal contradiction. The castle's origins encoded the tension between permanence and flexibility that would shape everything that followed. Hearst Castle began as an answer to insecurity. It sought to stabilize power by fixing it in place. The question it left unresolved was whether power, once fixed, could continue to function within a system that never stopped moving. The estate functioned not as a residence, but as an apparatus. Its daily life was governed by systems designed to sustain scale, manage complexity, and suppress friction. Nothing about Hearst Castle operated casually. Every routine existed to prevent disorder from overwhelming design. At its core, the estate depended on hierarchy. Labor was stratified with precision. Authority flowed downward through layers of supervision, each responsible for enforcing rhythm and consistency. This structure was not ornamental. Without it, the estate's size would have rendered it unmanageable. Order was produced through division, repetition, and constant oversight. Daily operations followed strict patterns. Maintenance was continuous rather than episodic. Surfaces required attention before deterioration became visible. Utilities demanded coordination across distance and elevation. Food, water, heat, and light were not conveniences, they were logistical challenges. The estate consumed resources at a rate that required uninterrupted supply and planning. Staff routines were designed to minimize unpredictability. Tasks were specialized. Movement was choreographed. The goal was not comfort, but reliability. The estate could not afford improvisation. Any disruption missed delivery, delayed repair. Absent labor introduced risk into a system already operating near its limits. Financial pressure was embedded in this structure. The cost of operation was not occasional or reactive, it was constant. The estate required money not simply to exist, but to remain coherent. Scale multiplied expense exponentially. What appeared static from the outside was sustained through perpetual expenditure. This pressure shaped behavior within the system. Efficiency was not measured by profit, but by continuity. The estate did not generate income proportional to its demands. It consumed value rather than producing it. As a result, financial control became inseparable from operational control. To lose command over one was to destabilize the other. The estate's isolation intensified these demands. Distance increased dependency on internal systems. Redundancy was essential. Supplies had to be anticipated. Labor shortages could not be resolved quickly. The castle operated as a semi-contained environment, requiring foresight to compensate for its remoteness. Social life within the estate was structured around these constraints. Events, gatherings, and routines were shaped by what the system could absorb without strain. The appearance of ease depended on immense preparation. Leisure was engineered. Spontaneity was managed rather than encouraged. What distinguished Hearst Castle from ordinary large residences was the absence of elasticity. Smaller estates can contract during periods of pressure. They can reduce staff, close wings, simplify routines. Hearst Castle resisted contraction. Its design assumed full operation. Partial use introduced inefficiency rather than relief. This rigidity required constant decision-making. Control was exercised daily, not strategically but operationally. The estate demanded attention to detail at every level. Authority was expressed through coordination rather than command alone. To run the estate was to engage continuously with its demands. In this sense, Hearst Castle functioned less like a home and more like an institution without delegation. There was no external body to absorb failure. The system depended entirely on sustained oversight. When control was present, the estate appeared effortless. When control weakened, strain became visible. The castle's operation revealed a fundamental truth about scale. Grandeur is not self-sustaining. It requires systems capable of suppressing entropy. Hearst Castle survived day to day through discipline, hierarchy, and expense. Its continued function was not guaranteed by its architecture, but by the constant application of control. The financial structure supporting the estate was inseparable from its operational rhythm. Money did not arrive as a surplus, it was allocated as necessity. Expenditure followed the logic of maintenance rather than growth. The estate absorbed capital in a continuous stream, converting wealth into stability, order, and appearance. This conversion had limits. Unlike industrial systems, the estate did not scale efficiently. Costs increased as complexity accumulated. Each addition amplified the burden on existing infrastructure. Expansion did not create leverage, it created dependency. The system grew more elaborate but also more fragile. Control, therefore, became preventative. Decisions were made to avoid exposure rather than pursue opportunity. The estate did not experiment, it stabilized. This mindset permeated every level of operation. Change was treated as risk. Preservation of function took precedence over adaptation. The staff hierarchy reflected this priority. Authority emphasized enforcement over innovation. Procedures were valued above judgment. The system rewarded consistency, not creativity. This ensured reliability but reduced flexibility. Over time, the estate became increasingly dependent on its own routines. What emerged was a closed loop. Resources entered, were consumed to sustain order, and exited as maintenance. Little accumulated internally beyond structure itself. The estate did not generate momentum, it resisted decay. Its success was measured by the absence of visible failure. This model functioned as long as external conditions remained favorable. Continuous funding allowed the system to suppress stress. But the estate had no internal mechanism for contraction. When pressure increased financial, social, or logistical, the system could not recalibrate. It could only endure or cease. The estate's operational demands also shaped its relationship with time. Everything was immediate. Maintenance could not be deferred. Staffing could not be reduced without consequence. The castle required presence, financial and managerial, without interruption. Absence of control did not produce gradual decline, it produced rapid instability. This dependency exposed a structural vulnerability. The estate's coherence was not embedded in its design alone, but in the ongoing exertion of authority. Once that authority weakened, the system lost its capacity to manage complexity. Order became unsustainable. Hearst Castle's daily function demonstrated the cost of architectural ambition. The estate did not fail because it was mismanaged. It functioned precisely as designed. The problem lay in the design's assumptions that control could be maintained indefinitely and that resources would always be available to sustain it. In practice, the estate converted wealth into obligation. Ownership became a continuous act of expenditure. The castle demanded not only money, but attention, coordination, and tolerance for inefficiency. It rewarded these sacrifices with stability, not return. This reality complicates the image of grandeur. Hearst Castle was not a static monument, but a system under constant strain. Its elegance depended on suppression of entropy, of uncertainty, of cost. The estate's operation revealed that scale, once achieved, becomes its own form of pressure. By functioning as a closed system, the castle insulated itself from external change, but at the cost of resilience. It could endure only as long as control remained absolute. When that control became unsustainable, the system had no alternative mode of existence. The daily life of Hearst Castle thus contained the seeds of its transformation. The very mechanisms that sustained it also limited its future. The estate functioned flawlessly until the conditions that made such functioning possible began to shift. At its peak, the estate ceased to feel aspirational and became declarative. Hearst Castle no longer pointed toward power, it exercised it. The systems that once strained under ambition aligned into coherence. Scale, resources, and control converged, allowing the estate to operate exactly as it had been conceived. During this period, the castle did not merely host influence, it organized it. Social gravity formed naturally around the estate, drawing political figures, cultural leaders, and institutional actors into its orbit. Presence at the castle carried meaning. It signaled proximity to authority rather than novelty. Attendance conferred recognition without needing explanation. What distinguished this phase was effortlessness. The immense operational demands that defined the estate's daily life receded from view. Staff routines functioned smoothly. Logistics absorbed pressure without disruption. The estate appeared calm, ordered, and self-possessed. This appearance was not illusion. It was the result of systems finally operating at capacity. The castle's symbolic dominance rested on this stability. Power was no longer defensive. It did not need to justify its scale or assert its legitimacy. The estate's existence had normalized its excess. What once seemed extraordinary became expected. Grandeur, repeated consistently, transformed into authority. Cultural influence during this era was indirect but decisive. The estate did not persuade through argument or display. It persuaded through context. Conversations held within its walls carried weight because of where they occurred. Decisions made there acquired gravity simply by association. The castle amplified influence by framing it. This framing extended beyond individuals. Institutions responded to the estate as a fixed point within elite culture. It was understood as a place where continuity was assumed, not questioned. The castle's permanence appeared assured. Its scale suggested that it would outlast the circumstances that produced it. Importantly, the estate did not compete with other centers of power. It existed alongside them, above transactional necessity. Financial markets fluctuated. Political alliances shifted. Hearst Castle remained unchanged. This constancy reinforced its authority. Stability itself became a form of dominance. At its apex, the estate also achieved internal balance. The tension between ambition and sustainability temporarily resolved. Expenditure aligned with resources. Control matched complexity. The castle no longer strained against its own design. It functioned as a closed, self-reinforcing system. This balance allowed the estate to shape elite behavior. Norms formed around its scale and expectations. What constituted appropriate ambition shifted upward. The castle recalibrated the boundaries of private power by demonstrating what was possible when wealth operated without constraint. Yet this peak contained an implicit assumption that conditions enabling such alignment would persist. The estate's authority depended on uninterrupted control, stable resources, and cultural deference. None of these were guaranteed, but at the height of its influence, they appeared permanent. In this moment, Hearst Castle fulfilled its original purpose. It translated wealth into legitimacy, scale into authority, and presence into power. The fortress no longer needed to defend itself. It had become the standard against which private ambition was measured. The estate's dominance during this period was reinforced by its ability to remain insulated from scrutiny. Its authority was not subject to public negotiation or institutional oversight. Decisions affecting its operation, its culture, and its boundaries were internal. This autonomy distinguished the castle from emerging corporate and governmental centers of power, which increasingly required justification and transparency. Hearst Castle functioned as a private axis around which elite life could rotate without exposure. Its remoteness was an advantage. Distance limited intrusion and preserved discretion. The estate became a place where influence could circulate without record, where alignment occurred informally, shielded from external accountability. This autonomy extended to cultural production. Taste, preference, and aesthetic judgment were exercised without reference to public approval. The estate's coherence allowed it to set its own standards. In doing so, it reinforced the idea that authority could originate privately and radiate outward, rather than being granted by consensus. The castle's social environment reflected this confidence. Interaction within the estate followed implicit rules shaped by hierarchy and expectation. There was no need to assert status overtly. The setting itself established rank. Social order was embedded in space rather than enforced through protocol. Symbolic dominance also manifested through restraint. At its peak, the estate did not need to expand further. Its completeness communicated sufficiency. The absence of visible ambition reinforced the perception of stability. Power that does not seek validation appears settled, and settlement commands respect. This period also marked the moment when the estate's narrative solidified. Hearst Castle was no longer a project in progress. It was an institution with a defined identity. Its meaning became legible to those who encountered it. The fortress had become a reference point rather than an anomaly, yet this dominance depended on alignment across multiple systems. Economic conditions supported sustained expenditure. Social norms tolerated concentrated private authority. Cultural fascination with grandeur had not yet turned to skepticism. The estate thrived within this convergence. The castle's peak was therefore conditional, not absolute. Its authority was real, but it rested on external stability. This dependency was not immediately apparent. The estate appeared self-contained, its power self-sustaining. But beneath that appearance lay reliance on conditions beyond its control. At its height, Hearst Castle demonstrated the upper limit of private power in America. It showed how far wealth could go when insulated from constraint and concentrated into place. The estate did not merely reflect elite ambition, it temporarily fulfilled it. This fulfillment masked fragility. The very completeness that defined the peak reduced adaptability. The estate had optimized itself for a specific environment. Any shift in that environment would test its capacity to maintain coherence. But during this period, such shifts seemed distant. The castle's authority felt settled, its permanence assured. Private power had reached its apex, embodied in stone, hierarchy, and silence. Hearst Castle stood as proof that American wealth could, for a time, behave like empire. Pressure did not arrive at Hearst Castle as crisis. It entered gradually, through accumulation rather than rupture. The estate continued to function. Its systems remained intact. Yet the conditions that once supported its logic began to shift, subtly but persistently. The first source of strain was scale itself. What had once symbolized authority now demanded constant justification. The estate's size no longer spoke only of power, it invited scrutiny. Its operational demands became increasingly visible against a changing economic landscape. Resources were still available, but their allocation began to feel disproportionate. Cost had always been integral to the estate's identity. Expense was not a flaw, it was a feature. But as economic cycles tightened and public attitudes shifted, expenditure lost its insulation. What had once been interpreted as seriousness began to resemble excess. The castle did not become unaffordable, it became difficult to explain. This difficulty mattered. Elite power depends not only on capacity, but on acceptance. Hearst Castle's authority had rested on cultural tolerance for private dominance. As that tolerance weakened, the estate's scale no longer resolved doubt. Instead, it amplified it. The castle's presence began to generate questions rather than answers. Social realities were also changing. The concentration of private authority that once appeared aspirational increasingly appeared anachronistic. New institutions, corporate, governmental, bureaucratic reorganized power around process rather than possession. Influence became more distributed, less attached to place. The estate's model of authority began to feel isolated. Importantly, the estate did not fail under this pressure. Its systems absorbed strain as they had always done. Maintenance continued. Staff hierarchies remained functional. The castle did not deteriorate. What changed was the relationship between effort and meaning. The same level of control now produced diminishing returns. This shift introduced a new kind of burden. The estate demanded continued investment, but its cultural yield declined. Each act of preservation required justification beyond tradition or ambition. The castle was still impressive, but impression alone no longer carried legitimacy. The pressure was therefore ideological as much as financial. The estate had been built to assert permanence in a fluid society. As fluidity became normalized, permanence lost its authority. Stability began to resemble stagnation. The castle's resistance to change, once a strength, became a liability. Ownership also became more complex. The concentration of responsibility that had enabled decisive control now exposed vulnerability. The estate required uninterrupted commitment. Any reduction in attention or resources immediately revealed imbalance. Scale magnified absence as much as presence. What emerged was not collapse but friction. The system continued to operate, but with increasing effort. Control became more demanding, less intuitive. Decisions that once reinforced authority now required defense. The estate had not outgrown its resources, it had outgrown its justification. This distinction is critical. Hearst Castle did not become unsustainable in absolute terms. It became misaligned with the cultural environment that once validated it. The pressures entering the system did not threaten immediate survival. They threatened relevance. At this stage, the estate still functioned as designed. But the assumptions underlying that design were no longer stable. The castle faced a condition it had not been built to address, a world in which private power was tolerated only when it explained itself. The system could endure this pressure for a time. But endurance required adaptation, and adaptation was not embedded in the estate's logic. Pressure had entered quietly. Whether the system could absorb it without altering its identity remained unresolved. As pressure accumulated, the estate's internal balance began to narrow. Systems that had once operated with margin now functioned at threshold. The difference was subtle but consequential. Control remained possible, but it required more attention, more justification, more intervention. The estate did not lose capacity, it lost ease. Financial commitment increasingly resembled obligation rather than expression. Expenditure no longer reinforced authority automatically. Each allocation became a conscious act of preservation rather than an extension of confidence. The castle's costs were predictable, but their purpose felt less self-evident. This shift altered the meaning of ownership. What had once been a position of command became a responsibility of containment. Decisions focused on preventing deterioration rather than shaping the future. The estate's logic turned inward, prioritizing stability over assertion. Social context intensified this transformation. As private power became more scrutinized, the castle's autonomy appeared less natural. The idea that a single estate could operate beyond public accountability weakened. The estate was not challenged directly, it was reframed. Its authority was no longer assumed. This reframing did not require opposition. It emerged through comparison. New centers of influence, corporate boards, regulatory institutions, distributed networks, operated differently. They derived legitimacy from process, transparency, and adaptability. Hearst Castle's authority derived from presence and continuity. The contrast grew increasingly stark. The estate's isolation, once a source of strength, now compounded pressure. Distance limited flexibility. It made adaptation slower and more expensive. The castle could not recalibrate incrementally. Any change reverberated across the system, amplifying risk. As a result, decision-making became conservative. Innovation was avoided. The estate's systems were optimized for preservation, not transformation. This protected structure but constrained purpose. The castle continued to function, but it no longer set terms. What the estate faced was not financial exhaustion, but cultural exhaustion. Its symbolic language no longer aligned with prevailing expectations of power. Grandeur ceased to persuade, stability ceased to impress. The castle's scale began to read as inertia. Yet abandonment remained unthinkable. The estate still commanded resources sufficient to maintain it. Its decline was not forced, it was deferred. Pressure accumulated without triggering decisive change. This condition, maintainable but unjustifiable, was the most dangerous. It allowed the system to continue without resolution. The estate existed in suspension, preserved by habit rather than purpose. Control persisted, but conviction eroded. Hearst Castle did not collapse under this strain. It remained intact, impressive, functional. But its role shifted quietly. The estate ceased to define elite ambition and began to exemplify its limits. Pressure had entered the system not as threat but as exposure. The castle now stood at a threshold it could not acknowledge directly. To adapt would require abandoning the logic that made it powerful. To remain unchanged would deepen misalignment. The system could continue, but only by postponing decision. This postponement marked the end of the estate's authority as a model. Hearst Castle had not failed. It had become difficult to defend as an expression of power. That difficulty, once introduced, could not be removed without altering the estate's identity. Pressure had done its work. The system remained operational, but its justification had begun to thin. What followed would not be collapse, but transformation, driven not by necessity but by the erosion of meaning. The transformation of Hearst Castle did not announce itself as decline. There was no visible failure, no abandonment, no rupture in continuity. The estate remained operational, intact, and carefully maintained. What changed was not condition, but orientation. Stewardship gave way to management. Stewardship implies intention beyond preservation. It assumes a future shaped by judgment, risk, and responsibility. Management does not. Management seeks equilibrium. It narrows purpose to what can be sustained without exposure. At Hearst Castle, this shift occurred quietly through a gradual redefinition of what ownership meant. The estate no longer functioned as a site of decision-making. It became a site of administration. Systems designed to support ambition were repurposed to contain complexity. Control remained, but it was procedural rather than expressive. Authority persisted, but it was exercised defensively. Extraction replaced cultivation. This extraction was not crude or exploitative in appearance. It took the form of stabilization, of reducing the estate's demands to what could be reliably supported. Rooms were fixed in meaning. Movement was constrained. Use was standardized. The estate began to yield value not through influence, but through manageability. This process narrowed the castle's purpose. It no longer needed to generate cultural gravity or social alignment. It needed only to remain coherent. The estate's systems were simplified not by reduction in scale, but by reduction in function. Complexity was tolerated only insofar as it could be controlled indefinitely. Flexibility diminished as a result. The estate could not experiment without risking imbalance. It could not evolve without destabilizing its carefully calibrated routines. The safest course was repetition. The castle became a loop, cycling through the same patterns of maintenance and presentation. Importantly, this hollowing did not diminish appearance. From the outside, the estate remained impressive. Its surfaces were preserved. Its grandeur was undisturbed. The hollowing occurred internally, in the relationship between the estate and power. The castle no longer shaped authority, it reflected a past configuration of it. Management also altered the estate's relationship with time. The future ceased to be a horizon and became a threat. Planning focused on prevention rather than possibility. The estate's systems were optimized to avoid deterioration, not to accommodate change. Time was something to be resisted, not engaged. This resistance further constrained purpose. The castle's identity became fixed. It could no longer respond to shifting cultural conditions. Its meaning hardened into representation. The estate existed to be maintained as it was, not to assert what it might become. What made this hollowing distinct was its gentleness. No single decision marked the transition. There was no moment of surrender. The estate continued to operate, drawing resources, employing systems, and maintaining order. But the logic driving these activities had inverted. The estate no longer justified its demands through authority. Authority justified itself through preservation. This inversion recast power as burden. Control became obligation. Ownership became oversight. The estate's vast systems, once instruments of dominance, now functioned to contain liability. The castle survived by narrowing its exposure to consequence. Hollowing without collapse is difficult to perceive because it preserves form. The walls stand. The routines continue. The system appears stable, yet its core function has been evacuated. What remains is a structure optimized to persist, not to lead. Hearst Castle entered this phase without resistance because resistance would have required reasserting purpose. Purpose, by this point, had become the source of risk. Management offered safety. Stewardship required conviction. The estate chose safety. As management solidified, the estate's relationship with power became increasingly abstract. Authority no longer emanated from decisions made within its walls. Instead, the castle served as a repository of resources, of memory, of controlled access. Power existed around it, but no longer through it. This abstraction altered how value was extracted. The estate no longer converted wealth into influence. It converted influence into stability. Its worth was measured by its ability to remain intact, to avoid controversy, to minimize demand. The castle's presence justified its own maintenance, but little else. Management favored predictability. Systems were optimized to ensure that outcomes remained consistent. This consistency reduced risk, but also eliminated initiative. The estate could no longer surprise. It could only reassure. Its grandeur became static, its authority inert. The narrowing of purpose also changed the estate's internal culture. Roles became custodial rather than generative. Labor focused on preservation rather than production. The estate's complexity, once a source of dynamism, became something to be contained. Staff enforced continuity rather than facilitated ambition. This shift introduced a subtle form of extraction. The castle drew resources, financial, administrative, cultural, not to create new meaning, but to sustain existing form. Value was extracted from the past and spent on preventing loss. The estate fed on its own history. Importantly, this extraction did not register as decline. The estate did not lose stature and appearance. It lost capacity. Its systems no longer engaged with uncertainty. Without exposure to consequence, authority loses relevance. Power that cannot act cannot endure as power. The castle's insulation from risk became total. Every procedure minimized discretion. Every decision avoided interpretation. The estate functioned within boundaries designed to eliminate variability. This made it durable but inflexible. Over time, this inflexibility hardened into identity. The estate ceased to be a place where private authority was exercised. It became a place where private authority was remembered. The difference was not visible in stone, but it was decisive. Hollowing also removed accountability. When power recedes, responsibility disperses. Decisions affecting the estate were no longer expressions of ownership, but outcomes of process. No single will guided its future. This absence of authorship further narrowed purpose. The castle's survival now depended on its neutrality. It could not offend, it could not assert, it could not demand. Its endurance required that it remain acceptable to all stakeholders. This requirement stripped it of the capacity to define terms. Hearst Castle did not collapse because collapse requires conflict. The estate avoided conflict by relinquishing ambition. In doing so, it preserved itself at the cost of authority. What remained was a system perfected for maintenance, incapable of leadership. This is the quiet end of private power, not destruction, but dilution. The estate continued to exist, but it no longer shaped the environment that sustained it. It adapted by withdrawing. Hollowing without collapse is not failure. It is a strategic retreat disguised as continuity. Hearst Castle endured by becoming something else entirely. The transition into institutional control did not occur as rescue, it occurred as resolution. Hearst Castle entered public stewardship, not because it was failing, but because it had reached the limits of private coherence. The system could continue only by relinquishing authorship. Institutional absorption differs fundamentally from inheritance. It does not extend intention, it replaces it. The estate ceased to be guided by a singular will and became governed by mandate. Authority shifted from discretionary control to regulated responsibility. This shift preserved the structure while dissolving dominance. The transfer reframed the estate's purpose. Survival became explicit rather than assumed. Under institutional control, the castle no longer needed to justify its existence through power or relevance. Its legitimacy derived from preservation itself. The question was no longer why the estate should endure, but how. This reframing neutralized conflict. Institutional systems are designed to manage continuity without ambition. They replace risk with procedure. In absorbing the estate, public control removed the pressures that private ownership could no longer absorb. The castle was stabilized by limiting its capacity to act. Neutralization was not punitive. It was pragmatic. The estate's scale, cost, and visibility made it incompatible with personal control. Institutional oversight transformed those liabilities into responsibilities. The castle became accountable, but no longer expressive. Under this arrangement, decision-making diffused outward. No single authority could redefine the estate's future. Choices were constrained by policy, budget, and public expectation. This diffusion eliminated the possibility of dominance. Power was not transferred, it was disassembled. Institutional absorption also altered the estate's relationship with time. The future was no longer imagined as extension or evolution. It became a planning horizon. Change was incremental, reversible, and justified through preservation standards. The castle entered a state of managed permanence. This permanence came at the cost of authorship. The estate could no longer assert identity beyond what had already been established. Its meaning was fixed at the point of transfer. Institutional systems preserved by freezing interpretation, ensuring continuity at the expense of relevance. What the estate gained was endurance. What it lost was sovereignty. Institutional control resolved the contradictions that private ownership could no longer manage by removing the need for resolution altogether. The castle was preserved precisely because it no longer needed to mean anything beyond itself. This form of survival is uniquely modern. It allows structures of immense ambition to persist without confronting the conditions that produce them. Institutional absorption converts private excess into public artifact. The estate becomes evidence rather than participant. Hearst Castle's absorption marked the end of private dominance without spectacle. There was no fall from grace, no public reckoning. The estate simply crossed a threshold beyond which private authority could no longer operate convincingly. The castle did not resist this transition. Resistance would have required renewed assertion of purpose. Purpose, by this stage, had become incompatible with survival. Institutional control offered certainty without demand. In entering public stewardship, Hearst Castle achieved stability by relinquishing voice. Its systems were preserved, but its agency was removed. The estate remained visible, intact, and impressive, yet fundamentally altered. This was not destruction. It was neutralization. Institutional control altered the estate's internal logic as thoroughly as it altered its authority. Systems once oriented around discretion were recalibrated toward compliance. Where private control relied on judgment, institutional stewardship relied on alignment. The estate became answerable not to intention, but to framework. This framework prioritized continuity over interpretation. Every intervention required justification through preservation criteria rather than purpose. The castle could be repaired, stabilized, restored, but not reimagined. Change was permitted only when it returned the estate closer to a defined historical state. Innovation, once a function of authority, was excluded by design. In this environment, the estate's complexity became manageable precisely because it was no longer active. Rooms were no longer adaptive spaces, they became fixed references. Circulation was regulated, use was standardized. The castle's former unpredictability was replaced by controlled repetition. Institutional absorption also dissolved hierarchy in a specific way. Authority did not disappear, it fragmented. Responsibility was distributed across departments, budgets, and mandates. No single figure bore the weight of ownership. This diffusion protected the estate from personal failure, but it also removed accountability as a lived experience. The castle's relationship with the public emerged from this structure. Access was granted not as invitation, but as entitlement managed through policy. The estate was no longer selective, it was regulated. This shift did not democratize power, it neutralized it. The castle became available, but inert. Visibility increased as influence declined. Hearst Castle was now seen by more people than ever before, yet it shaped fewer outcomes. Exposure replaced authority. The estate's presence entered cultural memory rather than cultural negotiation. This transition also resolved the financial paradox that had long defined the estate. Under institutional control, cost no longer signaled dominance or burden. It became a budget line. Expenditure was justified through public value rather than private conviction. The castle no longer demanded belief in its necessity. It required only administrative support. What emerged was a new equilibrium. The estate was protected from decay, insulated from controversy, and stabilized against ambition. It no longer strained against its environment. But this stability was achieved through withdrawal from relevance. The castle's scale was preserved, but its meaning narrowed. Institutional absorption did not reinterpret Hearst Castle, it contained it. The estate story was formalized. Its contradictions were managed rather than resolved. The castle could exist indefinitely in this state because it no longer challenged the conditions that sustained it. This endurance came with a final transformation. The estate ceased to be a site where power was exercised and became a site where power was remembered. Its authority was historical, not operative. It belonged to the past even as it occupied the present. The effectiveness of institutional control lies in its quietness. There was no need for confrontation. Private dominance ended not through opposition but through absorption. The system that replaced it did not argue against power, it rendered power unnecessary. Hearst Castle survived by becoming compatible with a world that no longer accommodated private empire. Its preservation resolved the problem it had come to represent. The estate no longer tested the limits of authority, it illustrated them. In this state, the castle achieved permanence without consequence. It would not fall, it would not rise, it would remain, contained, curated, and complete. The institution had absorbed the estate, and in doing so, had removed the last trace of private dominance without erasing the structure that once embodied it. What survives at Hearst Castle is form. Stone, scale, proportion, and surface remain carefully intact. The estate endures as an object of attention, stabilized against erosion and protected from neglect. Its visibility is assured, its condition is maintained, yet survival, in this context, is selective. What remains is not the system that once animated the estate, but the residue it left behind. The castle no longer functions as a site of decision or consequence. Nothing that occurs within its walls alters its future trajectory. The building persists, but it does not act. Its rooms no longer shape behavior, only observation. The estate has been relieved of responsibility, and with that relief, it has lost function. This distinction defines what has been lost. Hearst Castle was once a mechanism through which wealth organized space, labor, and culture. It demanded coordination, judgment, and continuous assertion of control. Today, those demands have been removed. The estate exists without requiring authority to sustain it. What survives, then, is appearance without obligation, grandeur without exposure. The castle's size still commands attention, but it no longer commands resources in the same way. Its maintenance is distributed, normalized, and justified through institutional logic rather than private will. The loss is subtle because it is not visible in deterioration. The estate has not decayed into ruin, its surfaces are preserved, its narratives curated. But the absence of function is total. The castle no longer participates in the environment that surrounds it. It no longer negotiates with time or circumstance. It is held apart. This condition reveals something essential about American wealth. The capacity to build has rarely been in question. Scale, ambition, and technical ability have been demonstrated repeatedly. What proves more elusive is the ability to sustain meaning across generations without surrendering control. Hearst Castle could not evolve without ceasing to be what it was. Its design assumed permanence through assertion rather than adaptation. Once assertion became untenable, the estate's only viable future lay in preservation. Survival required withdrawal from relevance. What American wealth produced at Hearst Castle was a finished argument. The estate articulated a vision of authority rooted in presence, scale, and confidence. That vision could be constructed rapidly. It could be maintained temporarily, but it could not be extended indefinitely without transformation. The castle now survives as evidence of that limitation. It stands complete, but it does not continue. Its meaning is contained within its past configuration. The estate no longer generates authority, it illustrates it. This outcome does not diminish the achievement. The castle remains extraordinary, but its endurance depends on neutrality. It can no longer assert values, impose standards, or shape behavior. Its preservation requires that it remain silent. What is gone is not wealth, but agency. The estate no longer expresses private power. It no longer converts resources into influence. Its systems have been dismantled or repurposed to prevent precisely that function. What remains is a structure stabilized against consequence. Hearst Castle survives because it no longer asks anything of the world around it. It exists on terms that ensure longevity, not relevance. In this way, the estate becomes a measure rather than a force. It shows how far American ambition could go and where it ultimately stopped. The castle did not fail. It reached the boundary of what private power could sustain. The castle's endurance now depends on distance. Distance from decision, from risk, from authorship. It remains visible, but it no longer intervenes. Its presence is acknowledged, but it does not participate. This distance ensures preservation, but it also defines absence. What survives most clearly is intention frozen in material. The estate still communicates confidence, order, and ambition, but these qualities are no longer active. They are observed rather than enacted. The castle speaks in the past tense. This transformation clarifies a broader pattern within American wealth. Private power has excelled at construction, but it has struggled with continuity. The conditions that enable rapid accumulation often undermine long-term stewardship. Scale is achieved quickly. Systems capable of carrying scale forward are not. Hearst Castle exposes this imbalance. It required constant assertion to remain meaningful as a private institution. Once assertion became unsustainable, the estate could either dissolve or withdraw. It chose withdrawal. Preservation became a substitute for purpose. The structure's survival depends on its compatibility with institutional systems that value neutrality over ambition. This compatibility ensures endurance, but it also erases the estate's original function. The castle now exists as a resolved object, not an evolving system. What American wealth could not sustain here was authorship across time. The estate did not fail due to mismanagement or decline in resources. It reached a point where continuity required surrendering the very authority that defined it. That surrender was necessary, but it was also terminal. The absence of private function has consequences. The estate no longer generates culture, it curates it. It no longer organizes power, it exhibits it. Influence has been replaced by memory. The castle's role is interpretive rather than operative. This distinction matters because it reframes success. Hearst Castle is often described as preserved, saved, protected. All of these are accurate. But preservation is not the same as survival of function. The estate continues to exist, but it no longer does what it was built to do. The building remains. The ideology does not. The system that once converted wealth into authority has been dismantled. What stands now is an artifact of that system, stabilized to prevent reactivation. In this sense, Hearst Castle offers a quiet conclusion. It does not warn or celebrate. It demonstrates. It shows the outer boundary of private ambition in a society that ultimately favors institutional continuity over personal dominance. What survives is form, carefully maintained. What is gone is power exercised through place. The estate stands intact, yet emptied of consequence. This is not tragedy, it is resolution. The castle has found a way to endure without authority. In doing so, it reveals a truth about American wealth. It can build monuments of immense ambition, but it struggles to sustain them as living systems beyond the conditions that created them. Hearst Castle remains, complete, preserved, and silent.